The Afar Triangle shimmered beneath a sun so fierce it bleached the world of color. The volcanic plains stretched to the horizon in bands of ochre and bone white, a place where time itself seemed fossilized. Heat devils rose like translucent spirits over the rocks. Dr. Alejandro Ruiz leaned against the ridge of his trench, his breath ragged through the mask. The dust burned his throat. He'd been digging since dawn. "Nothing but basalt and disappointment," he muttered in Spanish. From the edge of the pit, Tadesse, the local guide and field assistant, grinned. "You said that yesterday, Doctor. The Earth has patience. You do not." Ruiz looked up, smirking through exhaustion. "The Earth's patience runs on geological time. Mine runs on grant funding." The rest of the small crew laughed. They were a mix of Spanish, Ethiopian, and Kenyan graduate students, young, idealistic, overworked. Their base camp near Hadar was little more than a cluster of canvas tents and one wheezing generator. Yet in their hearts, each carried the same irrational hope, that the next shovelful would change the story of humankind. The rumor. It had begun 3 weeks earlier when a herder from a nearby Afar village brought in a photograph. The picture showed a slab of stone half buried after a flash flood. It was covered in markings, not like the usual tribal carvings or modern graffiti, but arranged in symmetrical rows. Ruiz had studied the photo in silence for a long time before muttering, "That's no goat scratch." His mentor, Professor Mancini, back in Barcelona, had advised him not to chase mirages, but Ruiz couldn't help himself. The geometry of the carvings, their subtle repetitions, suggested intention, even system, the discovery. Now, standing knee-deep in the trench, his trowel scraped something hard. The sound was unmistakable, stone against metal, but not ordinary basalt. Smoother, denser. He froze, brushed away dust, and saw it. A flat, polished surface embedded in sediment. "Maria!" he shouted. "Down here! Rapido!" Maria del Toro, his graduate assistant, slid down the slope. Her eyes widened. "That's no flake. That's carved." They knelt side by side, brushing gently. Slowly the markings emerged. Rows of faint pictographs, spirals, branching lines, and stylized animals. The air seemed to thicken around them. "It's not random," Ruiz whispered. This is structured." Maria frowned. "But what language? Not Sabaean, not Proto-Arabic, and not any language I know." Ruiz's voice trembled slightly. "It's older." Tadesse approached cautiously. "My grandfather said stones speak if you listen long enough," he said quietly. Ruiz smiled. "Let's hear what this one has to say." They photographed the slab, mapped its coordinates, then began the delicate process of extraction. By sunset, the tablet rested in a field tent under gauze and reverent silence. First examination. Under the orange glow of kerosene lamps, they examined the artifact. It was basalt, roughly 40 centimeters by 60, weighing nearly 30 kilos. The surface had been deliberately ground flat. Carvings covered one side, pictographs arranged in horizontal bands. Each row told a transformation, a fish-like figure in one, a four-legged creature in the next, then something half upright. Above them, a spiral unfurled like a galaxy. Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "Is it possible? Are these stages?" Ruiz nodded slowly. "Variation, transformation, and the spiral. Time." She looked up sharply. "Natural selection? In pictures?" He didn't answer. The thought was too outrageous, yet there it was, etched in stone, the rhythm of life unfolding. Journey to Addis. 2 days later, a UN transport helicopter lifted the find to the National Museum in Addis Ababa. Ruiz accompanied it, staring out the window as the Ethiopian desert rolled away beneath them. Ancient, silent, knowing. He thought of Darwin's voyage aboard the Beagle, how observation became revelation. But Darwin had had books and microscopes. Whoever carved this tablet had only dust and time. At the museum, In the museum's laboratory, Dr. Leah Tekla greeted them, Ethiopia's foremost paleoanthropologist, sharp-eyed and unflinching. She bent over the tablet, tracing the surface with gloved hands. Basalt, yes, a far lava flow. Weathering indicates extreme age. No tool marks from metal chisels. Ruiz asked, "How old?" She tilted her head toward the microscope. 50,000 years. Maybe more. Maria gasped. But writing symbolic thought that predates the Upper Paleolithic. Leah smiled faintly. So it seems your ancestors were more literate than we thought. Patterns within patterns. Back in the lab, Ruiz and Maria began photographing every square centimeter. They fed images into pattern recognition software. By night, the tablet glowed on their monitors like an alien map. It's cyclical, Maria noted, not narrative. Look, same figures recur, but altered slightly. Ruiz overlaid transparent sheets, tracing transitions. Variation, modification, and see here. Those with longer limbs persist, the others vanish. Selection, she said softly. He turned toward her. If this is genuine, it's the earliest model of natural selection ever recorded. Not philosophy, observation. Maria's eyes gleamed. Design without a designer. They sat in silence, awed, doubt and evidence. The next weeks blurred into feverish work. Samples from soil embedded in the carvings were dated independently by Leah's team. Every test confirmed its authenticity. The tablet was at least 55,000 years old, but the implications tore through academia like wildfire. Some hailed it as evidence of a forgotten civilization. Others called it a hoax. Religious authorities whispered of blasphemy. Professor Mancini arrived from Barcelona, skeptical but intrigued. He examined the artifact with a magnifying lens. Beautiful, he admitted, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Ruiz bristled. We have that. You have data, Mancini said. But meaning? That's interpretation. Be careful, Alejandro. The line between revelation and ruin is thin. Night reflections. That night, unable to sleep, Ruiz walked the museum courtyard. The city hummed beyond the walls, but here only the whisper of wind touched the eucalyptus leaves. He thought about evolution, the blind elegance of it. Could a tribe tens of thousands of years ago have glimpsed that same elegance through observation alone? Had they watched generations of animals adapt, change, and die, and drawn what they saw? Or was it something deeper, a pattern etched into consciousness itself, waiting to be rediscovered? The moonlight fell across the tablet through the lab window. For a fleeting moment he thought the spiral seemed to turn. The whispering stone. Weeks later, during a power outage, the lab was plunged into darkness. Ruiz, fumbling for a flashlight, heard a faint humming, a low resonance from the tablet itself. He froze. It wasn't mechanical, it was almost vocal. He leaned close, heart hammering. The sound faded as quickly as it came. Perhaps the cooling basalt, or perhaps not. When light returned, he noticed something new, a faint pattern of micro cracks forming an unfamiliar shape near the spiral's edge, a branching line that resembled a tree. He smiled bitterly. The tree of life, he murmured. You're mocking me. But deep down, awe drowned doubt. The message of dust. By the time they prepared the tablet for shipment to Spain, Ruiz knew he was standing at a threshold. He told Maria quietly, if this is genuine, we'll have to rethink human history. The mind capable of this was not primitive. She replied, maybe we never were. Maybe we've just forgotten what we once knew. He smiled sadly. The earth remembers, Tadessa said. And maybe, Maria whispered, it's remembering through us. The crate was sealed. Outside, the desert wind rose, swirling through the museum courtyard like an ancient breath. Somewhere in that wind, Ruiz thought he heard a whisper, not of ghosts, but of reason itself, stirring in the dust. Ancient evolution mystery, the spiral without a maker, Conso, southern nations, nationalities and peoples region, Ethiopia. The wind came uphill off the Sargon River in a dry breath that smelled of crushed sage, old dust, and iron-rich soil. Goat bells clinked on the terraces. Down in Trench 5B, Mark Solé brushed fine sand from a stone surface the color of early morning. He was 29 on his first season as an assistant field director, a Barcelonan with a talent for photogrammetry and a weakness for improbable hypotheses he had learned to keep to himself. "Careful, Akesh," said Hirut Wandimu, the principal investigator. She perched on the trench edge, eyes narrowed. Years of desert fieldwork had bleached her hat, but not her judgment. "It looks like a worked face." Mark nodded and switched to a goat hair brush. The gleam that had snagged his attention was not mica or quartz, but a deliberate plane. Basalt shaved flat and then pecked smooth. A centimeter from his brush tip, a groove curved, shallow and precise, not natural. "Dawit!" Hirut called to the foreman. "Shade!" Canvas went up in practiced movements. The trench dropped into cool, semi-darkness. Mark misted the surface and the groove came up like a river after rain, a line the width of a thumbnail, running to an intersection where two more lines met like tree branches. "Incised," Hirut said. "And there, look." "That's not script." She glanced at Mark. "You're the iconography nerd. What do you call it?" "Pictograms," Mark said, already setting the camera, already mapping with string and tape. "More like picture graphs. No letters. We'll see." He didn't say, "I think I see animals," because every stone in Ethiopia could be a lion if you squinted long enough. They lifted the slab with slings and foam, working inch by inch, stripping sediment from underneath to free it. It was heavy. Basalt will make you honest. When they tipped it to a padded board, sand fell like marbles from the underside, revealing a second face, blank but for thin weathering. "Orientation?" Hirut asked. "Face down," Mark said. The incised side was down. "So it was laid intentionally," she said, and they both felt the electric needle stick of purpose. They did the first pass under the shade tree beside the sighthouse. Water, brush, patience. The slab measured 88 by 52 centimeters, 6 centimeters thick. On the polished face, grooves less than 3 millimeters deep, carved figures arranged in registers from lower left to upper right. The bottom register, small antelope-like animals, oval bodies and stick legs, with horns that differed, some long and straight, some short and curled, some asymmetric like a broken comb. Near them, small nuggets that might be seeds and short sprigs, plants. Above them, larger figures with long jaws and sloping backs. Hyenas, Mark thought, or dogs. Some chased, some stood with their jaws clamped around an antelope's throat, indicated by a sharp bend and 3 tiny lines that could only be blood. Above those, paired figures, adult and juvenile, the young smaller, their horns resembling the adults. A repeat of patterns. And beside all of this, cutting across registers, a spiral, a tight whirl of lines with small dot clusters stepping around it like beads on a tally rope. "St. Anthony!" breathed Isabella Martin, the visiting prehistorian from Barcelona, when she saw it. "You luck-kissed goat!" "Don't tempt bureaucracy," said Hirut, smiling despite herself. "Context," said Mark. He had the habit of talking to the artifact, a habit that slowed him. "What did you want to say?" "Don't talk to it," said Dawit, half joking, half not. "You'll give it ideas." That evening, under yellow solar light in the compound's lab tent, they did the first set of high-resolution images, visible, raking light, shortwave infrared. Mark built a 3D mesh on his laptop as the generator chugged, and in the mesh, the incisions came up with near-microscopic relief, each tool mark visible as a scallop. "It's not Gez," said Meron Tesfaye, the historical linguist from Addis Ababa University, as she ran a finger, gloved, careful, just shy of the surface. "This is no script I know." "It's not meant as writing," Isabella said. "It's an argument in pictures." "Argument?" said Meron. "With whom?" "Not with whom," Mark said, surprising himself. "With chance." The next morning they logged the tablet, bagged the loose sample for sediment analysis, and documented the trench. The permit folder showed a thick stack of stamps, ARCCH signatures. Export permit for study under a 2-month MOU. Itemized chain of custody logs. Handover plan committing to return. Ethiopia taught you to be a better archaeologist or to go home. They drove the slab into Konso in a battered Prado with an escort from the Wareda and put it in a reinforced travel case. Then on to Addis in a courier van with an RCCH officer named Tamrat glued to the chain of custody like a guardian spirit. "I will breathe out when I sign it back," Tamrat said, patting the case. "Until then, I am a man without lungs." Barcelona's damp, salt-breathed heat smelled like anchovies and ozone after Addis's resinous highland air. At the Universitat, the lab smelled like acetone and fume hoods and coffee. Mark rolled the case into the imaging lab and looked up at a poster he had taped to his office door in graduate school. "Extraordinary claims are invitations to be careful." They were careful. They ran reflectance transformation imaging, RT1, cross-polarized at multiple angles. The incisions popped like relief maps. They ran micro-CT scanning, just basalt and voids, no hidden cavities, no insets. They lifted trace organics with a micro-scalpel from the deepest parts of the incisions, a smear of something that might be gum or plant resin, and fed them into the FTIR. They measured a tiny inclusion of desert varnish on one corner under SEM. The varnish layers looked like a cake of manganese and clay, thin microlaminae which, if lucky, could be dated relative to known varnish sequences. They took a fragment of sediment still glued to the underside with ancient soil and sieved it. Charcoal flecks went into an AMSQ. "Stop!" said Professor Elena Boras, the lab director, when the third day's excitement threatened to outrun skepticism. "Say what you see, not what you want to see." "What do we see?" "Animals," Isabella said. "A herd with variation." "Predators," said Mark. "Some animals survive, some don't." That choice seems crucial. "Adults and young," said Merrin. "Resemblance across generations. Horn shapes repeating. That's inheritance depicted, unless I've lost all caution." "And a spiral with dots," said Elena. "Time? Seasons? Or a game?" "Or a dance," said Isabella. "Or a snare? Or a belly?" Elena tapped the table. "Good. The magic words, or, keep them." 2 weeks later, the first dates came back. The charcoal flecks from the underside sediment, detritus caught under the slab when it was laid face down, came out to a centennial window centered on the middle of the first millennium CE. The varnish microlamination suggested exposure and burial cycles, but the only safe inference was that the slab's exposed edge had been out in the open long enough for varnish to grow before someone set it face down. And the FTIR, the sticky trace from the incisions, matched plant gums similar to gum arabic, but with a polysaccharide profile closer to Acacia etbaica, local to Ethiopian highlands. Someone had rubbed something into the lines long ago, colorant binder to make them show. It would not save them from the nagging problem of time. "Radiocarbon can't date stone," Eleanor said. "Only the dirt and glue around it." "But it's promising. If the charcoal got trapped when they set it down, the slab is older than that. The incisions are older than the laying down." "That would put the carving?" Isabella said. Merrin lifted a hand. "We're not there yet. We need to talk tool marks." Mark had already run the comparative library. Bronze made an incision with a certain burr, iron with a different one, steel with a crispness sharp as sugar glass. Under high magnification, the slab's lines showed variability, scallops whose radii mapped to a narrow set of chisels, but with two distinct profiles. Older strokes, abraded, softened, their micro-burrs smoothed by time, edges rounded under countless touch events and wind. Newer strokes, still crisp, with chatter like a modern hand's quickness. The shock in his throat dried his mouth. "Multiple carving episodes," he said. "At least 2. Elena folded her arms. "Or differential weathering." "Not with the slab face down," Mark said, pointing to the abrasion patterns. "Look, this groove is intersected by that one. The one on top has a clean wall that cuts a bevel into the lower. That superposition means the upper is newer." "How much newer?" Isabella asked. If we had a patina deposition rate for this specific manganese varnish, a century, a millennium. It's a mess, Mark said. That's archaeology, Elena said. Welcome to the mess. They painted the lab walls in possibilities, an ancient tablet reused, a teaching stone maintained and added to, a later ritualist repaired a sacred image by sharpening lines, a forger. Let's use ethics as a compass, said Merrin. If this is real, it matters more to Ethiopia than to Barcelona. Tamrat will want news. They had barely drafted the sober, careful joint memo when a leak slashed sobriety open. Someone, no one admitted who, sent a JPEG from a lab camera to a friend. The friend blogged. The blog trended. And by Monday, the headline had metastasized from "Intriguing Ethiopian pictograms suggest ideas about nature" to "Oldest Darwin." Ethiopian tablet explains evolution millennia before Europeans. What part of "or" did they not hear? Elena said. What part of "return" will ARCCH hear? Merrin said. She had a lawyer's calm that came from having spent half her career retrieving artifacts from sloppy hands. We promised them no publicity until joint review. Tamrat called with a voice you could shave on. If this is a carnival, close the tent, he said. We will send a person. A person arrived that afternoon in the form of an RCCH conservator named Selamawit, who spoke softly and wrote everything down. She read the memo. She walked the lab. She leaned over the slab without touching. There are two hands, she said, and then to Mark. Show me where you think the younger is. He showed her the spiral. It was so neat. The animals in the lower registers showed variation. Horns thick and thin, coats decorated with pebble-like dots and smooth. The predators pulled down the stragglers. The paired adults and young held resemblance. And the spiral with its stepping dot clusters, harvests, seasons, looked like time. It could be an astonishing visual argument. Design without a designer. Difference is sifted. Resemblance passes through. Time accumulates. Or it could be what we wanted to see. Selamawit frowned. That three-turn spiral is not like the rest. Why? Isabella asked. It has a certain impatience, Selamawit said. Impatience, Mark said. Old hands make lines as if time is oil they have plenty of, she said. They do not rush the stone. This spiral runs. In the lab at midnight, Mark watched the spiral's edges under 100 times. The toolburrs were so crisp he could have pricked his finger on them. A buzz began. Tungsten carbide sharpness? No, that was too modern. But iron, well-wrought? Or steel from any time in the last 6 centuries, used by a maker with no callous of patience. He was still there at 2 a.m., mindful of strategies, when he heard the click of the back door. The slab lay under a cover. Habit, respect, fear. The click came again. He turned off the monitor and stood with his breath held. The third click was the slow, certain sound of someone with a toolkit and a plan. Hey, he said into the dark. The figure froze. The monitor's afterglow gave him an outline. Athletic, slight, a lab coat. Axel, Mark said, relief and dismay mingled to an unpleasant taste. Dr. Axel Brunner, visiting evolutionary biologist, brilliant and show-off, lifted his hands. I thought if I just... Look, I need to see the spiral. You need to wait until morning, Mark said. With everyone. I have a grant due, Axel said, as if that explained burglary. Get out, Mark said. Axel left, throwing his hands up as if this refusal was a personal injury. Mark locked the door, texted Eleanor, and tried to swallow the acid taste of both the night and what it meant. The spiral had become a magnet for the kind of ambition that corrodes. Under a magnification regime more rigorous than insomnia, the spiral gave itself up not in one confession but in a series like an onion peeled. Micro-residues inside its grooves carried not only acacia gum, but traces of a plant ash consistent with burned coffee husks. Coffee. Ethiopia's gift to the world. No mystery there, except that the way the ash had been used suggested it was rubbed into the groove as a pigment. The rest of the slab's incisions, where residue survived, carried iron oxide ochre and charcoal black. Only the spiral consistently carried this coffee ash binder, and the coffee's phytoliths, those tiny silica ghosts of plant cells, were of a variety more common in domesticated Coffea arabica cultivars than wild varietals. Too specific, Eleanor warned when Mark bubbled. People used what they had. But note it, and note this. Coffee husk ash in pigment becomes common in liturgical retouching in Ethiopia in the 19th century, when coffee ceremony culture blooms into every household. That's a rough correlation. It could be older, Marin said. Coffee is old in Ethiopia, but we're not arguing about the existence of coffee. We're asking whether this spiral was refreshed or incised anew by someone in the last several centuries. And there's the steel, said Mark. He brought up a comparative photomicrograph of berins used by medieval iron versus modern hardened steel. The chisels that made the spiral sang like steel. The older figures, especially the hyenas, had chatter patterns like small nibs resharpened on coarse stones. Different hands, different centuries reading the same images with their fingers. Selamawit leaned closer. Say it plainly, she said. Not to the press, to ourselves. The spiral is later, Mark said. He felt something drop inside him, not disappointment, but a sloughing off of an intoxicant. At least parts of it are. It cuts across older lines. Its tool signature is newer. Its binder is different. We're looking at a palimpsest. The older layers, variation, predators, resemblance, could be ancient. The time spiral might be a later addition. And that ruins the headline, Axel said from the doorway, unable not to enter when there was blood. There goes oldest Darwin. Merrin turned. Science is not the child of your press release, she said. It is a patient aunt who outlives your drama. Axel flushed, offered a mocking bow, and fled. What we have, Eleanor said, is more interesting than a headline. It's a teaching stone used across centuries, maybe a game board, maybe a mnemonic for herders about breeding choices, maybe a liturgical parable about life, and at some point, somebody older than us but more modern than the stone added this spiral to make explicit what time was always doing in the background. Who? Said Isabella. And why? Conso's elders met them under the fig tree in a circle of low stools. The return to Ethiopia had been swift. Selamawit moved paperwork with the ferocity of a storm. The slab lay in a padded crate under a canvas tarp, while dust glowed in the late afternoon light like a jam jar of gold leaf. This is not ours, said Kifler, the oldest of the elders, after a long silence that was not empty but full of thought. Our stones are the waga with faces and swords. He moved his palm in a short curve. This has an old flavor. Maybe people from the north, or other times. Stories? Heorot asked. My grandfather told me a story of a rock with a spiral where the priests counted years for a famine, but that rock had crosses also, and it was stolen when I was a child, Kifler said. Everything with a story is stolen, isn't it? Not this time, said Selamawit. They visited a rock shelter a kilometre from Trench 5B, whose ceiling was soot-blackened, whose back wall held faint red outlines of hunters and cattle overpainted with white zigzags. DS Stretch, the photo enhancement tool, pulled the ghosts forward. The zigzags freshened by someone not long ago, the red animals older, harder to grasp. On a low shelf, Isabella's hand touched a shallow depression in the rock the size of a child's palm. Game, she said. Gibetta. Mankala, count and capture. Some game stones become teaching stones. Mathematics wears skins. What if our slab was once a game board, Mark said, and then a lesson, and then a lecture, and then a memory. They could not prove it in that cave, but the thought fit like a key that did not yet open doors but made the lock click with promise. That night, under mosquito nets, Mark and Merrin talked quietly. I feel like a fraud, he said. I saw Darwin where there is just life. People made sense of animals. Of course they did. They had to eat. You're not a fraud, Merrin said. You're an eager mammal. You saw a pattern and smiled because patterns are delicious. But let me tell you a story from our side of the mountains. She told him about Zera Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher, whose Hateta asked why things were the way they were, whose rationalism bloomed from old soil. "We are not strangers to thinking," she said. "No one is. The surprise, if there is one, is that you expected surprise." He listened and felt something like shame and like gratitude. The next day, they drove out to a monastery on a plateau where the stone church grew from the rock as if rooted. The abbot, a small man with a voice like a bell, showed them a collection of tablets, tabot, copies of the Ark used in liturgy, not to be touched, not to be looked at except with permission and humility. In a corner drawer, in a stack of objects that had fallen out of use, was a wooden tablet carved in shallow relief, animals, a predator, an adult with a child, and a spiral. Mark's mouth went dry. The spiral was not exact. Its dot clusters were not in the same positions, but the grammar of it was the same. The idea of time curling, of things repeating, but not precisely, of counting not just 1, 2, 3, but 1 again with a tilt. "Where from?" asked Merrin carefully. The abbot smiled. "You come asking for dates," he said. "I can give you stories." This came from a priest in the time of my great-grandteacher who said his father learned it in Gondar from a man who had travelled with a Frenchman who made maps. "Dabadi," whispered Meron. "Antoine Thompson Dabadi. 19th century." "Maps," said the abbot with satisfaction. "Everything you people love." In a town down the hill, a scribe's grandson showed them a family chest, and after long talk and coffee and stronger coffee, a codex with Ge'ez text in a tidy hand. In the margin, a spiral drawn in bold pen with a note in Amharic, "Years they pass and the herd changes as God allows." There it was again, time, herd, change, God, and beside it, a gloss in a different hand. Some say it is not God, but the hyena. Merrin touched the gloss as you would touch a forehead. "Blasphemy and biology make such good neighbors," she said. "Is this our spiral?" Mark asked. "Our spiral has a modern impatience," Selamowit said. "This spiral was ink and for talk. Your spiral is chisel and for assertion." "How far back does this spiral idea go?" Hirut asked. "And was it imported or homegrown?" Meron exhaled. "Some adventures we will not have in this life," she said, "but we can triangulate." Dabadi travelled with Ethiopian scholars. He collected ideas and sometimes left new ones. The book Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation circulated in French circles in the 1840s. Lamarck's ghost was still walking. These are whispers only. What we have in hand is a stone with layers. "So, the older layers," Mark said, "assume provisionally they're early medieval. Herders depicting variation, predators resemblance. They would have known about selective breeding by practice. They knew that horns breed true. They knew culls. They knew seasons would select." "Design with a designer," Isabella said. "They selected. They were the mechanism." "And the later layer," said Eleanor on the phone from Barcelona. "The spiral that suggests time as an external force." "Design without a designer," Mark said quietly. "A notion or a provocation that the hyena itself chooses, and that choice shifts herds without human hand." "Lamarck would argue function shapes form," said Axel, who had reappeared without apology and now contributed as if his midnight visit had been a dream. "These spirals, these comments, could be nothing but metaphors." "And metaphors," said Merrin, "are clumsy when they get jobs. Yet sometimes they help you cross a river you cannot ford." "Let me ask an uglier question," Elena said, her voice small from 1,000 kilometers. "Are we sure our spiral isn't modern? As in 100 years old? As in a forgery?" Selamowit met Mark's eyes over the crate. "We are not sure of anything," she said. "We only have stronger or weaker shadows. But I will say this. People in the 19th century put coffee in their pigments and modern steel in their chisels and sometimes added clarity to old things, believing they were doing service. Restoration. Isabella said. Or revision. Often they crowd the same bench. Which leaves us, Elena said, with a borderline case of philosophy of science. How do we talk about a stone that accumulates ideas like a coral head, accretes skeletons? Carefully, said Merrin, and with gratitude, and with the stone at home. They prepared a paper with 5 authors distributed across 2 institutions and 2 countries and 6 disciplines. The title was dry because the work was not a multi-phase incised basalt slab from Conso, iconography, useware, and the visual grammar of herd management. The abstract sketched an object reused over centuries as a teaching aid among pastoralists. A later edition, likely a spiral denoting temporality, was cut across earlier lines in a newer tool signature with a different binder. The iconographic sequence admitted of an interpretation that included variation, predation, and trait inheritance, ideas present in any meat's-eye view of a herd, but that only later adopted a more explicit time spiral, possibly influenced by 19th century intellectual exchange. Readable without headlines, Eleanor said when they read it aloud. Teachable even if no one tweets. Unsexy enough that it might survive, said Isabella. Axel read the draft, his mouth working as he tamped down frustration. He wanted a comet, not a slow planet. But even he saw that the slow planet had moons, and those moons reflected light in their own way. The older stations on the slab surface spoke to the complexity of how knowledge grows. When they were done, Mark took the night shift in the lab, keeping watch like a priest. He had fallen a little in love with the slab, which was a professional hazard, but he had fallen more in love with the method, the way they had unseduced themselves from a headline into a story. He lifted the cover and laid his fingers a hair's breadth above the hyenas. Their mouths were open in a tempered, all-too-familiar curve. Hyenas choose, herds change, he said to the air, voicing the gloss he had seen. The left hand of God. He put the cover back on and went to make coffee, black and strong and hot like argument. The weeks that followed were both crushing and generous. The journal asked for more, deeper analysis of the tool marks, quantitative modeling of the spiral's dot clusters. Were they calendrical? A path-breaking statistician friend ran a Bayesian analysis. Given the sequence of dots and likely counting systems in the region, the spiral could plausibly represent a 354-day lunar year with dot clusters marking intercalary additions. A mechanism for reckoning years in a pastoralist economy. That was a story unrelated to natural selection and intimately tied to lived time. Eleanor, Mark said when the email landed, if the spiral is a calendar, then our first reading says more about us than about the stone. Of course it does, she said, which is why we test reading against alternative readings. Give me a diagram. He made one. The dots fell into a pattern that, viewed from another angle, looked like intercalations to realign lunar months with agricultural or transhuman seasons. That would explain the impatience Selamowit had seen. Someone in a later century had updated an old board to serve as a calendar. That someone might have brought a new hand and new tools and coffee ash to the task. Later, still recoded by scholars to be about Darwin. Layers upon layers. Merrin returned to the scribe's chest and asked about other marginalia. There had been an epidemic among cattle in the 1820s, the grandson said. The notes recorded that those with spots fell, while those with smooth coats lived, which led to a local conclusion. That color mattered. It was easy to read a Manhattan elevator's language of selection into those lines. It was harder to read the lived intelligence out of them. Spots might signal a subherd with different behavior or ancestry, or just a superstition sharpened by grief. At the same time, Selamowit and Hirut, back in Conso, excavated near Trench 5B and found in a layer a half-meter above where the slab had lain a cache of incised bone tally sticks. Notched in regular sequences, coupled in pairs. Their FTIR traces carried acacia and coffee ash in different notches, different inks for different counts, numbers of cattle, days, rations. You could sink a career in the swamp of maybe. And then came the theft. It was not dramatic. No men in masks. The slab, under cover in a locked case in a lab whose locks had been checked twice, did not vanish. But their hard drives did. The RTI renderings, the 3D meshes, the photomicrographs, the diagrams. Elena stood in the wreckage of cables like a ship's rigging cut in port. Someone had known exactly what to take. Selamawit did not call the police first. She called Tamrat. "Chain of custody means nothing if the chain is spool," she said. "We need a spool made of iron." Tamrat arrived in 2 days with a second conservator and a quiet forensic specialist who treated the lab with the care of a surgeon. The specialist, whose name they never learned, lifted a thumbprint from the inner edge of the slab crate. "Axel," Mark said before the report. He did not want it to be Axel. He did not want it to be anyone close. It was Axel. At the confrontation, Axel said 3 things, in a row, as if throwing stones down a mountain to see which ones would start an avalanche. "I only wanted to protect the data. I thought you were going to bury the story. I wasn't going to sell anything." Elena looked like a dark star. "Get out," she said. And when he did not move quickly enough, she added, "No more grants through this lab. No more access. You may publish your apology first." He left. He did not publish an apology. His reputation did not shatter, but it acquired fissures you could see from orbit. It doesn't take a villain to make a mystery interesting, Mark thought. It takes fragile people in rooms full of sharp things. The twist did not come as a lightning strike. It arrived like the slow tilt of a compass needle that has been grazing a pocket knife and at last remembers north. It started with Marin's email to a friend at a small library in northern Spain, a library famous for oddities collected by missionaries and explorers. She asked about Dabadi's notebooks. The answer came back. The notebooks were in France, but a Jesuit based in Ethiopia in the 1860s, Father Josep Alabau, Catalan, had deposited a slim bundle of papers here in the 1870s. Including a letter that mentioned a stone of spirals used by Gala herdsmen, the old term for oromo, now considered pejorative. The library would not lend, but would allow viewing. Mark took a train. He sat with paper whose fibers gripped his skin. Father Alabau wrote in a field hand. He referenced a debate with a local Dabtara, a learned churchman, about the nature of change in creation. He mentioned a book by Chambers, which Mark, heart-thumping, recognized as likely vestiges of the natural history of creation. Alabau wrote, "The Dabtara smiled and said, 'The hyena is God's winnowing fork.' He drew a spiral on the earth with his finger and placed pebbles for the years. Mark flew back to Addis on a night plane, showed Meron the copy, and watched her put her head down on the table and laugh, not unkindly, at the cosmos. 'It's all here,' she said. 'A bulletin board across continents.' A Catalan priest snacks on British popular science and leaves crumbs in Ethiopia. A Dabtara hears it and turns it into a proverb about hyenas. Someone, not a forger but a repairer of stories, grinds coffee husk ash and deepens a spiral on an old board to make a calendar bright again and a parable visible. And then we, hungry, call it Darwin. We could still call it pre-Darwin, Mark said, mischievous and honest at once. There are many pre-Darwins, Meron said. What we mean is that ideas about change move on their own legs. They do not need passports. They wrote an addendum to their paper. They sharpened the dates of nothing and the clarity of everything else. They owned the palimpsest, but the slab had still more to give. Back in Barcelona, Selamawit suggested something that none of them liked. Take a microflake from the very center of the spiral, just a snowflake's worth, and run a high-precision metallography on the micro-scratches. Then compare them to the hoard of chisels recovered from a 19th-century metalworker's shop site in Gondar, whose micro-signatures had been catalogued in a recent project. The microflake could be taken without harming the image, and if it told them yes or no, yes, this was cut by a chisel like those, no, it was not, that would close a door or open another quietly. They did it. It matched. And on the chisel catalogue page in the Gondar publication, a note in the margin, "Workshop of Blatangeta Tesfaye, at the request of Abba Mebratu of Debre Berhan, to cut a teaching board for the count of years. Meron put her head in her hands. "We've been chasing an echo down a well," she said. "It's a calendar. It is not only a calendar, it is an idea given a face that changes." "Does that make the older registers less interesting?" Isabella asked, deflated. "No," said Elena, fierce. "It makes them more. It means people carried this board through centuries like a book. They refreshed it like you would a prayer or a recipe. It's archaeology as biography. And the fact that the 20th person to touch it thought about hyenas, and we thought about Darwin, and the first person thought about keeping calves alive. That is the story. And we still have the inheritance story," Mark said, pointing to the paired adults and juveniles with matching horns. They watched resemblance carry forward. They knew, long before priests and scientists argued about hyenas and winnowing forks, that the goat with the fat udder made daughters who filled the bowl. This was not a disappointment. It was a reshelving. The book had moved from miracle of premature evolutionary theory to long life of a teaching object in a world of hungry minds, which was to those who love books the better shelf. The twist, though, yes, there was another. The stone still had one secret left, and it kept it in plain sight. Mark saw it while tracing the spiral's dot clusters to test the calendar hypothesis with a better model. He noticed that one of the dot clusters had been altered. Under magnification, a dot had been turned into a tiny spoked wheel, no more than 2 millimeters across. He had taken it for a flourish. Now he noticed there were 3 such wheels, evenly spaced in the third ring of the spiral. "Wheels!" he said aloud, then shook his head. "No, too romantic. Ethiopia's ancient wagons are rare, and wheels are not common in iconography. But wheels also looked like flowers, or like suns, or like small birds seen from above." He clicked back and forth through wavelengths like a TV addict. In the UV, the little wheels popped as if highlighted. Their binder was not coffee and not acacia gum, but something proteinaceous, egg or casein, and their scratch pattern was softer, like a bone tool. "Meron," he said into his phone, "are you near a library?" "Always," she said. "Find for me," he said, "any mention in Ethiopian marginalia of 3 little suns in a spiral around the year 1839 to 1842, with a priest who argued with Father Alabau." Meron, who hated orders, hummed because she recognized the new music. "3 little suns," she said. "You are asking for astronomy." She found it in a letter from a monk at Debre Libanos to a colleague. The year, 1840. It mentioned a strange sky with 3 suns seen when ice crystals made a parhelion, sundogs, on a rare cold morning on the plateau. The monk wrote, "Abba Mebratu, put it into the counting board so children would remember the day the heavens had 3 eyes." The teaching board, the spiral, had become a mnemonic not just for years and herds, but for a day the sky did something weird. "3 little suns," Mark murmured, touching his forehead to the edge of the case. "Not Darwin, not even hyenas. A parhelion." "And here's the twist," Meron said on speaker with glee. "Darwin had nothing to do with this. But the person who cut the spiral, the one impatient with modern steel, he might have done it not to depict time as a general force, but to commemorate that day. A calendar with a story bead." "And then," Mark said, "we came along and read the story bead as the origin of species." "Which is frankly," said Elena from the doorway, having listened, "the most satisfying condemnation of us in a single line I have heard this year." They revised the paper again. They added an appendix about the 3 suns. They added humility in big, careful words. On the day the slab went home to Addis, they signed the handover under a window that showed the eucalyptus shimmering like coins. The crate closed, the seals were pressed, the chain of custody enriched with pen strokes that felt like small oaths. Tamrat, who had been breathless for 2 months, exhaled. "Now I have lungs again," he said. Selamawit put her hand on the crate. "We will display it with an annotation that says everything changes," she said, "including what we think about it." At the farewell dinner over injera and a lamb stew spiced with berbere, Kifl's grandson told a joke about hyenas and professors that made them all choke on their beer. Axel did not attend. He had resigned at least from their table. After dinner, under a sky as full of little suns as any could be without a parhelion, Mark stood with Merrin at the curb and felt the story settle into a shape he could carry. "You know what the surprising twist is, yes?" Merrin said. "That everything is more complicated than the story about how complicated everything is," Mark said. She laughed. "That and this, there was a design. But the designer wasn't God or hyenas or Darwin. It was us, people, redesigning the stone every time the world told us a new thing we wanted to remember." He nodded. "Design with a designer, after all." "But the designer," she said, "was never a single person. It was the many. That's the trick you hear in all this talk about design without a designer. We forget the crowd. I suspect even natural selection is a chorus." They stood listening to the chorus of night. A goat bleated like a hinge somewhere. The city ticked. In the morning they went to see the slab one last time. In the museum's lab, under clean light, a conservator had lifted grime no one had dared touch. And there, in the lower left, where the smallest antelope had always seemed to have a nick on its horn, the cleaning revealed a tiny, incised mark, 1/2 millimeter deep, which none of them had noticed. It was a hand. Not a handprint. You could not press your palm into basalt that way, but a drawing of a hand the size of a thumbnail, with 5 little fingers, cartoon simple and unmistakable, etched like a signature among the animals. It had been there as long as the oldest lines. It predated the spiral. It lived in the lair of the first carver. Mark laughed, out loud and loud enough that the guard smiled. It was an astonished laugh, a laugh that said, "Of course." "What?" Merrin said, rushing to the glass. "It's a hand," Mark said. "The first carver signed their work. No, more than that. They put their hand in the story. The oldest line on the slab is a person saying, 'I too am in this herd.'" Merrin peered, then clapped her hands. "The oldest twist," she said. "The designer is visible after all." "Or," said Mark, the good word returning to its seat between them, "or it's a tally, or a blessing, or a joke, or a hand raised to ask a question." Merrin's face softened. "Or," she said. "Yes." They went out into the Addis morning and joined the chorus. Behind them, in the lab, the stone lay and glowed with all its layers. Variation and predation, resemblance and time, calendars and hyenas and meteorological miracles and ancient self-portraits the size of a fingernail. The spiral was still there, impatient and bright. It counted not just years but readings, not just seasons but revisions. They had not solved a mystery, they had learned to live with one. And in a drawer somewhere in a little library in northern Spain, a letter kept its own watch over a line about 3 suns. And in Conso, under a fig tree, old men told stories about stones with arguments etched on them. And in Barcelona, a poster whispered, "Extraordinary claims are invitations to be careful." And a young archaeologist poured coffee, black and strong and hot like argument, and wondered what the next stone would teach him about what he knew already and what he did not.